side opposition can be summarized pretty simply in a couple of words. It's mine and you can't have any of it. But what we told you on the proposition is that this far too simplistic view of how we look at society isn't one that we can use to evaluate a principle in today's debate. Because when the collective good needs to be prioritized above a corporation's bottom line, we say that that policy is one that we are proud to propose. Because we presented a case that prioritized people, not profits, we were proud to propose today's motion. 3 things in the speech. Firstly, responding to some of the matter we heard from the opposition. Secondly, rebuilding some of the matter we heard from Sonia. And finally, presenting our 3rd substantive argument that patent protection is an unjust means to a profit-driven end. But first, let's begin with some of the things we heard from side opposition. Now, their first argument was this claim on private property. 4 responses to this. Firstly, we think that we're not looking at simple private property like we had in the past, right? The private property the opposition team is talking about isn't a cow like in rural societies. We're talking about something that has the potential for a massive collective societal good, and these kinds of things have to be evaluated differently than simple private property claims. Secondly, however, we think that the tangibility of these ideas particularly changes the nature of private property. Because anything in the technology industry necessarily has to be built upon something else that is pre-existing, we think we have to take that into consideration when determining whether or not an idea can truly be owned by someone if all other ideas are dependent upon it. Thirdly, we think that even if we concede in some mysterious world that this principle of private property exists in the technology industry, the motion is a question of prioritization. When the industry's bottom line of a huge corporation comes into conflict with individuals who can't even enter the industry in the first place, who do we prioritize? We stand for those smaller corporations. Fourth and finally, we think that if we look to the world of the proposition, we're defending the principle of private property more on the whole, because smaller companies who don't even have a right to private property in the first place because they're being crowded out of the market now gain that right. The maximization of private property damages their end at the end of the day. Then they give you this point, and they say, quote, even if it's poor for the economy, we support private property rights. We think this is a ludicrous claim, particularly when economies are supposed to be for collective good, not just for those people at the top of the economy. Then they give you this interrogation of what technology is, and they say governments can't regulate this. And they give you a couple of warnings of this. They say governments don't know what sector this technology in, and governments are too inflexible to evaluate these things. We think this is a ludicrous response, right? When governments evaluate billion-dollar legal claims on a daily basis, just because it's in the technology industry doesn't mean they can suddenly enter it. And then they say, well, we can implement stricter antitrust laws and regulations to ensure that frivolous litigation doesn't occur. 2 problems with this. Firstly, all of these things can still occur in the proposition world. We don't foreclose the opportunity for stricter regulation. But then this is a crucially damaging point, because if they support stricter regulation of private property, they concede the fact that private property isn't absolute and undercut their whole principled stance in today's debate. Then go on to the second argument, where they say that companies are going to become irrelevant. There's 2 individual problems with this. Firstly, if the impact of this point is monopolies growing, we think that greater monopolies are provided in the opposition world, because price gouging and monopolies are created when one company has the ability to hold a sole patent on a whole entire industry. But then they say companies are going to become irrelevant without patents. Companies are becoming irrelevant because they're stagnating due to their patents. This is the analysis Sonia gives you in the complacency argument in our second substantive, which goes completely conceded across the opposition. Then go on to some of the things that we have to rebuild our case on. The first thing they say is that smartphone prices have been dropping. What they don't tell you, however, is that relative to the cost to build smartphones, the prices are still insanely high, so this price gouging is occurring. Just giving you a simplistic analysis that, well, prices are dropping doesn't ensure that price gouging still isn't occurring. Then they say, well, you can't bully out everyone from the industry, and we think at best this is a defensive response, because these huge companies are still bullying out the most threatening competitors to them, which harms competition overall. Then they say, well, again, we support things like improving sanctions for frivolous lawsuits. Again, undercuts their principle and still can happen in the proposition world. Then finally, they say there's no incentive for small companies to grow larger under that side of the house. We think this is absurd, right? Small companies who have 1.1% of the market share, even if they grow to a multi-billion-dollar corporation, I'll take you in a second, still won't cross that threshold for companies like Apple, which have literally hundreds of billions of dollars. There's more than a big incentive to innovate. Go.
Competition in markets is reduced when you remove patents and the largest companies drive out smaller corporations, which you so care about, on your side.
The way that large companies can drive out smaller corporations is through enforcing patent litigation, right? We bring you this analysis in Sonia's first speech when we say monopolies are predicated upon the fact that a single company can own one piece of intellectual property that an industry is built upon. We break down those type of monopolies in the proposition world when we take out those large companies' right to these kinds of things. But then we never heard responses to a vast majority of the matters Sonia brought you. The first thing on our model, we said we can spur innovation in our world due to prize money. No response. Then Sonia told you that monopolies mean price gouging, when in the cell phone industry they can raise up the price of text messages 6,000 to 7,000%. We think that's a huge harm in the opposition world. We talked about how large companies want to profit off of children's education in the case of Khan Academy, and even brought you the example of kidney dialysis in Amgen, all of which we heard no responses to from Team UAE. But then in our second substantive, we talked about small businesses, building blocks, and replacement management, all of which went dropped by the opposition bench. Now moving on to our third substantive, that patent protection is an unjust means to a profit-driven end. First layer of analysis here on individual inventors and competitors. Individual inventors are essential for innovation. It's not company brands that create new tech products, it's the individuals that comprise these economies. It wasn't Apple that developed the vocal recognition software known as Siri, it was a man named Michael Phillips. This means that companies are able to take the ideas of the people working under them, often without their consent, and take credit for them, building profit off the personal investment of others. Likewise, companies are able to gain a substantial market share by undermining their competitors, I'll take you in a second, and use their substantial market share to deny their competitors platforms that consumers can access competing products on. For example, Microsoft utilized its dominance of the software market to deny other web browsing products the ability to get consumers on its products, and as a consequence, starve out their competition. Go.
Given there are a range of measures that I outlined in my speech how we increase competition and improve the market for smaller companies, why do we have to choose a measure which drastically restricts property rights?
Thank you. Again, I'll give you the same two responses I provided earlier. First off, these measures aren't exclusive to the opposition world, i.e. they can still happen in a world without patents for larger corporations. And secondly, if you concede the fact that we ought to regulate these corporations, you concede the fact that private property isn't absolute and undermine your whole principle. I think I was fairly clear on that. The second layer of analysis here is on the workers.
On that point, sir.
In order for companies to get large, they most often have to commit unjust actions, hence they don't have a legitimate claim to the patents for future innovations. Corporations don't have an inherent right to patents. They operate on a contractual basis between the government and the corporation. This means when corporations don't uphold their end of the bargain, i.e. through exploitation and leveraging of smaller corporations, they no longer have a legitimate claim to that patent. I.e., when you think of a corporation with large market share like Apple, you think of FaceTime and iPhones, not the faces of the exploited workers who had to craft that technology. I.e., when Foxconn, one of the largest technology providers for companies like Apple, like Samsung, had 14 suicides in 2010 because of horrible working conditions and horrible labor, we think these companies with large market shares who build their empires on this style of exploitation don't have a principled right to that patent, and on a practical level should not be able to perpetuate this exploitation in the future. We gave you a very simple case in today's debate. Private property can't be absolute. Even in our world, we defend the fact that we gain more private property, but also because we prioritize people, not profits, we were proud to propose.